Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the intelligent social media platform. We have not done a podcast in some time, but Dr. Jonathan Cook is back with us to discuss Washington Irving's Knickerbocker History of New York, a book that I found delightful on many levels, stylistically, intellectually, and I look forward to talking to Dr. Cook about it. It's been a little bit since we talked last. What did we talk about last time, Dr. Cook?
We're doing a fool's errand of
That's
Albion Torgay.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, and in addition to talking about Irving's text, we're going to be talking about a little bit about Dr. Cook's own paper that he wrote on the text, Prodigious Poop, Comic Context and Psychological Subtext in Irving's Knickerbocker History. This is something you wrote over 25 years ago. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah. I found it a very worthwhile read. I don't know. Is it possible for anybody to go online and find this paper that you wrote?
Well, it's only available in JSTOR.
So yes, it is if they have access to JSTOR.
Yeah, if they have access to JSTOR. Yeah.
Well, it was a fantastic read as well. I was telling Dr. Cook earlier how much I admired his approach to writing, and I was trying to find out what the secret code was to be able to write like he does. And it's really just an immersion in so many thinkers from the so many American authors, right? And that's kind of by osmosis. So I guess maybe we should start by talking about what exactly is the Knickerbocker History of New York. And like you, I'm pretty surprised that it's not better known. I told you earlier off camera that I was familiar with Sleepy Hollow, and I think you mentioned Rip Van Winkle. This was before you launch into this educational experience for people. I want to say that I found this to be tremendously intellectually stimulating. Personally, what I loved about this text was the play of cosmological and migratory ideas that consumes a great deal of this work. That was my favorite thing about it. Do you have one particular favorite thing about it that
Well,
is there any reason why you love it so much?
The comic spirit of it, the wit and the energy of it, and the just wonderful sort of no holds barred satire and just enjoyment that you get from reading this book, because he's just doing a constant burlesque of learning and history and local history and political satire, and he's kind of like a loose cannon firing everywhere. And it's kind of like you never know what his next target is going to be, but it's always going to be a perfect hit.
He's in possession of so much arcane knowledge too.
Yeah, he was incredibly well read for someone who was 26 when he published this. But of course, he did sort of stock up on learned references from a relatively limited number of books. I mean, if you gauge the elusiveness, you will be amazed by how extensive it is. But some of the early chapters, he does actually take references from some authorities, like Diogenes Laertius, who wrote a history early. He's a Greek historian of philosophy, and he wrote these biographies of a lot of well-known Greek philosophers, and so Irving cited him and used him as a reference point. He also used some other historians and took some of their references but he really did it so that it seemed like he's incredibly learned, and he was a very well-read young man to write.
So that's interesting. So I had no idea that he was 26 years old when he published this, but what you're saying is he because I'm like, how could you possibly get that much information into your skull by the time you're 26? I understand it's a different time. but he's borrowing a great deal, is what you're saying. So if we
Yeah,
were to do
well, and
some,
he was very, very well read. I mean, for instance, when he was 10 years old, he had read Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, which is like a 2,000-page epic poem that had a big influence on Spencer and Shakespeare and other writers.
you're the first person to tell me about this.
Yeah. So he read Don Quixote. Don Quixote is Cervantes is a big influence on the book, that the sort of burlesque, making fun of heroism and chivalry, and a lot of he's very well read in 18th century literature. Swift, Sterne, Fielding, definitely had read extensively in all those authors. And a lot of others not as well known. So anyway, he published his book in 1809. People who take college survey courses, they usually read the sketchbook, which is the volume that contains The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle and a bunch of other essays and stories published in 1819. So Irving, he's best known for those two short stories, but of course he wrote a ton of other material. He wrote several histories. He wrote,
Heard about Christopher Columbus.
He wrote the Life and Voyages of Columbus, which is a beautiful book. I read it years ago. And he wrote a book on the companions of Columbus, about all the other lesser-known navigators. So Columbus is a beautifully written book that is very compassionate towards the Native Americans, who were the victims of the early genocide of the Spanish. And he also wrote The Conquest of Granada, which is a history of the defeat of the Muslims in Spain in 1492, almost the same time as Columbus, discovered America, so to speak.
What I thought was interesting when I was looking into his biography of Christopher Columbus is I from what I understand, that that he's the one who popularized the idea that Columbus proved that the Earth was round, or a globe, or whatever.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
this was a pretty popular book written in the 1820s. And for his other Spanish writing, he wrote the Alhambra, which is a series of sketches about living in the Alhambra in Cordoba, in this beautiful old Muslim building at the, as a modern sort of tourist, and having all these interesting kind of out-of-body experiences of seeing the past. And the beauty of this monument. It's a pretty well-known book of his as well. But anyway, Knickerbocker History wasn't his first book. He'd published a bunch of sketches when he was a teenager about the theater in New York, and he fashioned himself Jonathan Oldstyle. And he was directly imitating the writers of The Spectator, the famous English journal that was published by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. Had a particular style, and they were very witty, and they chronicled events of London. They wrote literary history and literary criticism in the early 18th century. So he's kind of an imitator of The Spectator. And then he went to Europe from 1804 to 1806. He came back and he got involved in a project of writing these satirical papers that ended up being published as something called Salmagundi. And he wrote it with a friend of his named J.K. Paulding, who's an American writer, not that well known, and also his brother Peter was also a writer, and helped him actually with the history of New York. Because the history of New York started out as a joint project, kind of on the lines of Salmagundi, in 1808, and Peter had to drop out because he went to Europe. So Washington took over, I think Peter did some of the research for the first chapter of the book. And the book was actually meant to be started out as a satire on a book by a local polymath, Samuel Latham Mitchell, who was a doctor and a professor and a naturalist. And he wrote a book called The Picture of New York, describing New York City, sort of a topographical survey of the city and whatnot in, I think, 1807. And it was a pretty dry publication with a lot of facts in it. And they, as New Yorkers, wanted to write something that was kind of more fun and playful. So it began as a parody of this book, Picture of New York. And it turned into this kind of crazy universal narrative of the beginning of the world and the founding of America and the settling of New York by the Dutch, and then these three Dutch governors who were, he skipped over the first roughly 4 or 5, including Peter Minuit, who was the one who actually paid for Manhattan in 1626. So he has these three governors, ending with Peter Stuyvesant and 1664, which is when the British took over New York from the Dutch.
Now, I don't know if this is an appropriate time to interject this, but in your paper, and we'll get to that later on, but you do kind of a Freudian analysis of this text and the reasons for why Irving selected these three governors. We'll hold off on that, but I hope that you will sort of.
Yeah, I'll go over the whole scheme of that reading of the story. But I mean, the fact is, not that much was known about New Amsterdam. This Dutch colony, which began with the exploration of the Hudson by Henry Hudson in 1609. He was sailing for the Dutch. He was an English mariner, but he kind of felt he had a raw deal with the English, and he hired himself out to the Dutch West India Company, and he went over and discovered the Hudson River while he was trying to find the passage to to China. Of course, he thought if he went up the Hudson, maybe it would be the key to going around North America to China. But it turns out the river kept getting narrower and narrower, so he realized it wasn't going anywhere. So he went up, probably as far as Albany and turned around. And the Dutch claimed that region based on that and brought settlers over in, the 1620s and founded it as a trading settlement. It wasn't supposed to be a colony. It was a trading settlement. And Albany also was a trading settlement. And the big product, of course, was beaver pelts, fur, because that was a hot item in the European market at the time. I mean, other things were exported, including tobacco. That was an important export. But beaver pelts were the name of the game in the beginning. But there weren't that many things known about the Dutch period of New York history. And actually, there were a lot of documents in Dutch that were just put away in an archive that were just translated only beginning in the 1960s. And they are now kind of giving a really more detailed picture of the period of the Dutch control of New York. In fact, I'm just finishing a book of Russell Shorto, who wrote this really great book called The Island at the Center of the World, about the unknown story about the Dutch in New Amsterdam. And
are there any major revelations that you can let us in on?
Well, it's a greatly sort of granular history about the political conflicts and how the colony, New York, New Amsterdam, really pioneered the idea of representative government and freedom because of the conflict between a guy named Adrian van der Donck, who was a lawyer, who stood up for the rights of the people, and Peter Stuyvesant, who was kind of a military no nonsense director of local director appointed by the governor appointed by the West India Company. And Peter, Stuyvesant wanted to have, this guy Adrian Vanderdonk worked for Stuyvesant in the beginning, but then he realized that the people needed more representation. They didn't want to be pushed around by Stuyvesant, and they got into a big fight. Stuyvesant actually wanted to have the Adrian Vanderdonk executed, but Vanderdonk went to The Hague and talked to some higher ups and eventually worked it out so he attained more power for the representative council there. There was just nine reps, kind of an early city council, as opposed to having this dictatorial mayor. So it just gives a really detailed history about this conflict and tells you about how important Dutch culture was to the founding of New York and the incredible flowering of Dutch civilization as they won their war against Spain. Because they had this 80-year war going on because they were sort of occupied by Spain until 1648. They finally had the treaty to end this war. So anyway, it gives you some interesting background on New Amsterdam, and of course Irving didn't know any of this. He just had a few facts that he included, and he made up a bunch of things as well. So he's taking history and kind of remolding it into a sort of a comic procession, sort of these characters, historical characters, are cartoonish figures, but it's hilarious to read about them and their foibles, and some of the history has an element of truth to it.
Has this problematized things because of Irving's status? Have people taken the satirical elements to be historical truth, and therefore we have somewhat of a corrupt record?
Well, no, people recognize that it was not history pretty early. I mean, it's ironic because Irving dedicated the book to the New York Historical Society, founded in 1804 to collect records about New Amsterdam and early history of New York, because, of course, a new country needs to feel like it knows something about its past, and there really wasn't much in the way of New York history. There was a history by a guy named William White, published in 1757, who wrote on the province of New York, and there really wasn't very much at all. So there was a big push to collect historical documents, and Irving, of course, was making fun of the earnest efforts of these local New York scholars and men of letters to, get an authentic record of the city. So he said, well, he just did it as a sort of little exercise in humor to create his own little fake history. And he was reprimanded by some of the people in the New York Historical Society. They didn't like what he did. Gillian Verplanck famously told him, said that it was unkind, and it sort of implied this was a sort of bad sophomoric joke. But of course, you can't read it,
Well, you let me know here so I don't spread any fake news, okay? Now my entire life as a little kid, I was like, what? Why is the basketball team the New York Knicks? Oh, they're the New York Knickerbockers, and then we got this Knickerbocker thing. And I believe Irving
he invented the figure of Dietrich Knickerbocker.
So I think if memory serves me correctly, he says like the Knickerbocker means the like something about men who like nod over their books. I guess they're like is this
complete nonsense? It's
okay. This is nonsense.
It's playful etymology. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Where does Knickerbocker come from then?
Well, there was a Knickerbocker who was a representative in Congress, and so he actually was referring to a New York family that existed, but he was making up this eccentric loose cannon who supposedly wrote this history. I mean, it's a hoax. It's, very much a Swiftian hoax, sort of like Gulliver's Travels or some other literary hoaxes like that, because he really brilliantly introduced the book by putting in some newspaper advertisements saying that this eccentric man has left his hotel in New York City and we're looking for him, and he's left behind a manuscript and we can't find him. And then people say, well, he was seen going up the Hudson Valley, and so some people actually thought this was true, and but it was really to kind of get the public primed for the publication of the book, which happened on December 6, 1809, which just happens to be the day of St. Nicholas, who actually is it turned out to be the patron saint of New York, and the figure who became the model for Father Christmas with the poem of Clement Moore, St. Nicholas and the Night Before Christmas, that poem that created the legend of Nicholas going down the chimney bringing gifts for children. That was created by...
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know. It's always so interesting to me. Like, people are always like, "Oh, this war on Christmas and this and that." And I'm like,
Yeah.
You guys know that the Puritans did not celebrate Christmas, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, 1820s.
Yeah.
Clement Moore's, and he was basing that figure on Irving's use of St. Nicholas as the patron saint of New York. So anyway, that book was published December 6th. It meant intentionally, and people had been sort of primed to take an interest in it from these newspaper ads. So it actually was fairly popular when it came out. The publisher actually was in Philadelphia. He got it printed there, but then he was living in New York at the time. One of the interesting things about it is that he wrote it in 1808, 1809, and actually during that time he was engaged to the daughter of a New York lawyer and judge, Ogden Hoffman. And Matilda Hoffman was his fiancée, and she died in April 1809, a few months before the book was published, when he was still writing and revising. So, the death of his fiancée didn't put a damper on his ability to follow through. I think it gave him a more desperate energy to finish the book and to put it out. I mean, he'd already kind of mapped out the whole story, so I don't think it had much impact on his ability to recreate the mood, to touch up some passages and add material. But it is interesting that tragedy happened in towards the end of composition of the book.
we were talking about this earlier about how he was revising and updating. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in the editions? And
yeah, so 1809 was the first edition, and that's the raciest edition with all the great phallic and scatological humor, because there's quite a bit of it. I mean, if you read it, you're kind of surprised that this is Washington Irving, who most people think of as sort of a staid, standard 19th century author like Longfellow or Oliver Wendell Holmes, that kind of thing. But then in 1812, he published a new edition, and actually, the first edition had a lot of typos in it, a lot of spelling errors, and so he cleaned those up and he adjusted some passages. There was another edition, 1819, with some illustrations in it. I don't think the text was changed that much. But there was a big change in the 1848 edition when he really wanted to clear out anything that he thought would be offensive humor. And he added some satire on what was going on in the 1840s, the anti-rent movement, which involved killing, the Rensselaer estates. In the book, in Dutch New York, the most powerful patroon was Kilian van Rensselaer, who owned a big chunk of New York State around Albany. And, in the 1840s, it was finally the last holder of that estate died, and the tenants on these huge tracts of land kind of rebelled and refused to pay their rent. So there was what was called a rent war. And Irving, knowing that area really well, wrote in some new satirical material into that 1848 edition. So, you're getting a little bit of new kind of interesting topical satire, but if you read that edition, you're losing a lot of the initial kind of comic flair that he had when he was a young man.
That's something that's been nice about building Noetic and getting acquainted with so many texts, is kind of understanding that there were many that were dynamic. It's not, you just can't just point at one and say, okay, here's Knickerbocker's History of New York, or here's Leaves of Grass. Like, there are these multiple editions that are put out. But it can also be kind of frustrating because the individuals are not necessarily reading the same things. So like, yeah. So is there one edition that's
I would advise people to get the Penguin edition, which is pretty recent, and has the introduction isn't that great, but it's the 1809 edition, or the Library of America, the first edition of Irving's writings in the Library of America edition has the 1809 edition.
So you're more of a fan of the 1809.
Oh yeah, definitely, because that has all the racy humor.
Okay.
I mean, I couldn't have written my article if I was basing it on the 1848 edition. Of course, the 1848 edition, unfortunately, they did a standard works, modern, complete works of Irving by Twain Publishers, and for some reason they went with the 1848 edition for that scholarly edition of the history. So, but that would be only available in libraries, really. So,
So
do you want to bring in your article, or have we done enough background?
well, let's just say, I'll just talk about the structure of the book, which is 7 chapters.
Sure.
And Irving is, you can tell this is burlesque history because he's beginning with ideas about the creation of the world. I mean, he's kind of challenging the providential history of the time. I mean, here we have a new country. 1809. Irving was born in 1783 in New York, just at the end of the Revolutionary War. And the new country, everyone thinks that this was a providential occurrence, the creation of the United States. And of course, in New England, the Puritans are writing providential history about God led them to the New World and allowed them to expand and develop their cultures. And Irving, of course, is just throwing all this out the window because he's saying that, the creation of the world is an accident, the discovery of America is an accident. There's no providential history behind this. It's all just, things happening just out of the blue. So he's kind of undercutting the whole biblical framework for celebrating, the greatness of America because this was God's country,
Well, what's interesting with the providential conception of America is that you have a Puritan understanding of that, but then you have an Enlightenment understanding of that, and they're not. I'm all what strange bedfellows those things are. I think it's just so interesting that to this day we're still conflating them.
Yeah,
and they're two very, very different streams of thought.
Yeah. Well, Irving is sort of satirizing Enlightenment, philosophy and ideas, and he has a great chapter on ridiculing Jefferson in the character of William Keith, the governor in chapter 4, which is a disguised topical put down on Thomas Jefferson. So he's beginning with the history of the universe, and drawing in a lot of learned commentary from Greek philosophers and whatnot. And then he talks about the discovery of America and different theories about how, the American Indian came to the continent. And he actually cites a guy named John Pinkerton, who was a geographer, a Scottish geographer, who actually set forth one of the first theories that Americans really came over from Siberia. They were Asians who went over the Bering Straits, and when we actually know that area was frozen, so it was passable, 15,000 years ago. So Irving cites this guy Pinkerton, who theorized that's how people came to the North America. But that's only one among a number of theories that he cites. So in the first two chapters, you get all of these learned references to different theories that are basically being lampooned for the silliness of some of them, or the fact that they can't agree on anything. And then, of course, the Dutch are coming over. And by chapter 2, you have the Dutch arrival in the city, on this ship called the Good Vrouw, this kind of mythical ship that brings the first settlers over. And they're actually first, starting communities in Hoboken on the Jersey Shore. And then they finally move over to Manhattan in the 1620s, late 1620s. And then he focuses on three governors of the colony: Walter Van Twiller, William Kieft, and Peter Stuyvesant. So what I did when I read this book, I looked at some of the references and jokes and whatnot, and I realized that Irving he's creating a whole allegory of the settling of New York based on the creation of the procreation, gestation, and early childhood development of human beings. So you have a lot of references to eggs and sort of ideas of procreation in some of the metaphors that are used in the first chapter, and then gestation. When you have the Good Vrouw taking all these Dutch settlers over, they're kind of there's sort of a lot of womb sort of imagery in these chapters. And then when you get to Walter Van Twiller, you switch to an allegory of oral, anal, and genital modalities of childhood sensation. These are childhood developments. Divisions that were pioneered by Freud, but they're still more or less accepted that babies are basically focused on their mouths and putting everything in their mouth, and then by the time a child is 2 or so, they start getting really into their poop, and kind of taking pride in what comes out of their rear end, and then boys, 4 or 5, they suddenly look at their little member, and they say, wow, look at this thing. It's got a lot of, dynamic energy down there, including, urinating. So when you look at the references to these three governors, you see all this oral imagery and ingestion imagery around Walter Van Twiller, who's described as this big round-faced guy who's sort of a roundish body. I mean, he's described as like an overgrown baby. It's totally historically inaccurate because Walter Van Twiller was a young man who went back to Holland and lived for many decades there. When he left, he was only governor for about 3 or 4 years in the 1630s. So then when you get to William the Testy, you have a lot of sort of anal retentive imagery where he's talking about economy. We got to crack down on spending, and he's very proud of this proclamation that he sends up to the English because they're coming in conflict with the English settlements up in Connecticut and around Hartford. There's what's called the Fort of Good Hope, which was an actual fort outside Hartford. And Wilhelm's proclamation has this sort of scatological aura about it. And then when you get to Peter Stuyvesant, you have all these phallic jokes. I mean, you have a joke about, he has this trumpeter who goes around making his announcements. He's always putting his trumpet to his mouth. And he's very trusty. He's like always around Peter as though he's attached to him. And then, so I consider him sort of a positive duplication of this phallic motif in the characterization of Peter. But then he has a sort of negative comic double in this von Puffenberg, a general who screws up the fight against the Swedes down in Fort Christina, which is actually, there was a Swedish settlement down in Delaware, of course, Newcastle, Delaware, and this guy von Puffenberg is, miserably defeated, and he's sort of a negative phallic hero because he's associated with images of deflation. He's puffed up, but then he's full of hot air, basically. So you can sort of read between the lines that Irving was that's part of his comedy. He's writing an allegory of human development, written into as a subtext to his comic epic. And that makes this a work of literature because it's it's not history because it's not 100% true. It's got all of these literary references and this basic underlying scheme sort of unites this history in a way that no other large sort of model could unite it.
So do you think he was anticipating Freud, or?
I just think he was a sort of the baby of the family. He was the youngest boy, and he was sort of a spoiled boy. And I just think he intuited the fact that children, when they grow up, they're first obsessed with their mouths, and then I think he intuited. I mean, I don't think that Freud invented this and imposed it on human nature. I think he just recognized it because he was the first, one of the first psychologists who paid attention to children in any meaningful way. So I don't know, if you have nieces or nephews, listen to what they're talking about when they're 2. It's like taking a dump is like a big deal with them, And then little boys, that's their little penis it's got lots of potential,
Right. So I take it you're not the only person who's seen these.
I've known people, I've heard people confirm these facts. I mean, there's no doubt.
Oh no. I'm not contradicting the claims that you're making. What I'm trying to get at here is that it sounds like there's been a number of scholars who have recognized this connection between Freud and Irving.
No. I mean, I was the first one who made it.
Oh.
I made it, So no, I pioneered it. In fact, I've had a couple of people I read poo-pooed the idea. They think, oh well, how would Irving have known this before Freud wrote? I'm saying no. This was something that is encoded in our nature.
I mean, I buy that. I had no. Dr. Cook, we've been friends for so long. We've been working together for so long. I sometimes forget your imminence.
Yeah, well, that was me. And I hope, one of the reasons I want to recruit more readers of this book is so that I can have them read my article and get additional enjoyment out of Irving's genius in this book,
I'm just like casually talking to the man who discovered this great insight. I should treat you with. I should be gazing at you with more quiet awe, and not interrupting you all the time.
Well, I wish that more people had that attitude, but I hate to say that. I mean, You probably counted readers of my article on, several hands and toes.
Well, as I was saying before we got on here, as your friend, as your peer, it's incredibly well written, and I highly recommend that everybody check it out. And I'll say I've read your writing before, and it's an interesting juxtaposition because my acquaintance with your writing before, your writing has always been beautiful. Like here we have something that's like provocative and controversial mixed with your beautiful writing, and I saw you in a new light. Not it seemed like
Well, I'm really interested in literature and psychology. I mean, why writers produce their work and how it relates to their thinking and the dynamics of human nature and whatever. So I haven't really been able to work in that vein very much, but this was one. I mean, I would never be a Freudian critic because I don't buy most of his theories. I mean, Freud has been long out distanced by more up to date writers, but we should all know Freud and respect him at his best. I mean, obviously he's one of the great psychologists and writers of the early 20th century.
So after I finished Knickerbocker's history, I started Carl Jung's The Red Book. And then you sent this to me. We were supposed to do this a week ago. I had no idea I was going to have a chance to read your article. And then you sent it to me in the mail. And so I was really surprised that you had done the psychological analysis of it. And at the same time, the synchronicity of me getting into Jung. Yeah. Are there any other psychologists that you recommend when analyzing literature?
For literature? I really have to think. I haven't read anyone recently, but I mean, I'll interject if I suddenly think of one. Of course, these days evolutionary psychology is having a big impact on some literary criticism. There's a guy named Jonathan Gottschall who's written 2 or 3 really great books, and Joseph Carroll wrote a brilliant book on literature and evolutionary psychology. But this is a movement of the last 20 years or so.
Well, I'm sure our audience can figure out how to make the internet machine spit out those results. Well, I don't know how much more you want to say about the overall purpose of the book, or if you feel like we've effectively covered that in talking about the psychological dimensions of it. I don't know if you want to say more about the political satire. I am curious about, before I had read Knickerbocker's History of New York, I hadn't touched Irving in 30 years or something, probably, or 25 years. So I didn't really know what to expect. I was pleasantly surprised. It's one of the better surprises I've had with literature lately. Where does it fit in his entire authorship, or how do you? Yeah, if you could talk about that a little bit. I mean,
well, first of all, I have to make a confession about Irving, which is I always knew I had to write about Irving because I grew up very close to where he lived, starting in the 1830s and 40s. Sleepy Hollow, which is just south of Tarrytown, New York. Well, I grew up in Hastings on Hudson, New York, which is probably 20 minutes from Sleepy Hollow. So I went there as a kid, and I went there with my mother. It's called Sunnyside. It's a wonderful place. It was kind of a magical realm when I went there, long ago. You can go today. You pay $25 to get in. It's a lot of money, but it's right down by the Hudson River. And he lived there, 1835 to 1859 when he died. So Irving was someone who I always wanted to get to know better. And when I was reading in graduate school, I was reading, his best known works. And then I really sat down and started reading him extensively, and I read the Knickerbocker history, and I was like blown away by the comic really exuberance of this work, and just wondering why this book isn't taught more in college literature course. I mean, you can't really teach it in high school unless you had a really daring AP English teacher. But people settled for the sketchbook because it was the book that kind of made him famous in Europe. Sort of brought American literature put it on the map in 1819. But the History of New York was his first masterpiece, and in fact, Sir Walter Scott got a copy of the book and just loved it. And he wrote Irving. Irving went to England in 1815 partly to go say hello to Walter Scott, who is now, was the great writer of poetry in the early 19th century, and then became an historical novelist after 1815 with with a series of books he wrote anonymously. So this is a book that really should be taught in college courses as the first masterpiece of American literature, I think. Of course, Irving, he had to make money as a writer. His family had a hardware business. He went to England partly to do some hard work for the family business. Then the business went bankrupt, so he really had to make money. And he turned to the sentimental sketches of the sketchbook by Geoffrey Crayon. He created another pseudonymous author. And then he stayed in Europe. Went to Spain. He started writing Spanish history. He wrote the Voyages of Columbus, Conquest of Granada, which has a sort of humorous narrator, just like Knickerbocker history. And came back to the U.S. in about 1832, and he was really sort of out of it because, Andrew Jackson was the president now. Very different kind of country than the one he left. His family were kind of Federalist in the big division between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And in fact, the Knickerbocker history includes satire on Jefferson because, of course, he was the great Democratic leader and president until 1809, when things with England were getting worse and worse. And he satirizes Jefferson as a Federalist. Irving is pointing out that Jefferson was sort of pretentiously overlearned, and he failed to defend the port of New York from possible British invasion with this idea of economy. So the character of Walter Van Twiller includes satirical jabs at Jefferson. And you don't really know that when you read the book unless you've been tipped off and you know something about Jefferson. So Irving, to get back to his career, he wrote histories, and then he got back to the U.S. in 1832-33, and then he sort of immersed himself in. He took a trip out to the prairie. He wrote a journal of a trip to the prairie, which is very entertaining reading. He went on a buffalo hunt and whatnot. He wanted to get to know the country, this brand new country. And he wrote a book on, he became friends with the Astor family. John Jacob Astor asked him to write the history of how the Astor business about fur trapping developed in the West. Because Astor made his first big fortune with furs and then went into New York real estate and made more money at that point. So, he died in 1848, one of the first millionaires in America. I think he was worth $10 million. So Irving wrote that history of Astor's business called Astoria. Then he wrote, he took a guy named Captain Bonneville and rewrote his journals about his Western travels and explorations. So Irving was doing that in the 1830s. And then, of course, he was asked to be minister to Spain, so he went back to Spain in the early 1840s for 4 years. And And then when he came back from there, he wrote a few more sketches. Well, I should say back in the 1820s, he wrote Bracebridge Hall and Tales of a Traveler, which are two collections of sketches on the model of the sketchbook. And they're very enjoyable to read. They're sort of light, entertaining stories and sketches about English life by an American. Certainly fun to read. But then late in his life, he's living in Sunnyside. He devotes himself to a life of George Washington, 5 volumes, something that is rarely read. I haven't read it. He also wrote biographies of Mahomet, Muhammad, founder of Islam. He wrote a biography of Goldsmith as well, and who was one of his literary models. So he wrote a lot of biography, history.
I don't even know who Goldsmith is.
Well, The Deserted Village. He was a man of letters who was friends with Johnson. She Stoops to Conquer is a wonderful comedy, actually. He was a wonderful playwright. He wrote a satire.
Goldsmith.
Oliver Goldsmith. He wrote a satire about a Chinaman in London called The Citizen of the World, which was a model for Salmagundi. So he was a sort of 18th century satirist, writer. The Vicar of Wakefield is probably his best known book. It's taught.
I'm looking at his Wikipedia, and that one jumped out at me.
It's taught in surveys of 18th century literature. So Irving was, he kind of modeled himself on some of these 18th century writers, and people faulted him for that, as being superficially devoted to wit and manners. But he was also a romantic who participated in the movement of studying myths and legends. That's how the legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle developed out of his study of the mythology of the Hudson Valley that he wanted to promote. So, he had a long career, he wrote a lot, and he's a beautiful stylist. So whatever you read of his, you'll enjoy the writing, at least, even if you don't really think you're that interested in the subject.
Well, did you do a ranking here? Did you say where the Knickerbocker history
It's definitely his
ranked?
best book, I think, as literature. As a work of literature, you have to sort of separate what he wrote that was intentionally designed to be read as literature from books that he designed to be read as history, like his study of Columbus. That's meant to be read as history. It was factually accurate. He wrote historical biographies, Life of Washington, but sort of it's kind of half and
5 volumes on Washington. That's insane.
Yeah. He felt that it was sort of a duty because, he's named Washington Irving. He met the president when he was a boy, when he lived in New York, when he became president, 1788, I guess. So he felt it was sort of a homage to the great founder of the country.
A question for you: is that where like Sandberg got his idea to do all the Lincoln stuff? Is there any connection there?
I don't think so. I think Sandberg was, he's an Illinoisan who devoted to Lincoln. Irving was a New Yorker named after Washington. So I guess he felt it was his duty.
I went down this weird rabbit hole this week, and I found out that like Marilyn Monroe had an obsession with Lincoln.
Really?
And yeah, like apparently she viewed Lincoln as like, because she didn't have a dad, she viewed Lincoln as like her father figure, and she carried framed photos of Lincoln with her everywhere. It's pretty interesting photos. And apparently she was so obsessed with Lincoln that she befriended Sandberg, and they became friends over Lincoln.
Wow.
So,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
she was a very smart woman. Who was pretty well read, I think.
Yeah. The photos of her fixating on Lincoln are otherworldly. I highly encourage everyone to Google them and look at them. There's one where she's holding she's in a car and wearing I can see it. She's wearing pink and she's just brandishing the photos she takes with them. It's a bizarre little rabbit hole that I found.
Okay.
So, yeah. So
So let's just talk about reception and recognition of the book.
yeah, I mean, and I mean, I think you've kind of expressed your frustration that more people don't know about it.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll just elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, I think academics have every few years you have someone saying, why isn't this book better known? And it has, I mean, probably a couple of dozen articles on it and chapters of books, but certainly not getting that much attention compared to the sketchbook. I mean, Irving, of course, is people like him. They are picked over by academics. When all the major authors have thousands of books written on them, you turn to the sort of second rank authors like Irving. But he's certainly he's getting some attention, but not as much as he deserves, and this book certainly not. But there are modern biographies of Irving. There's an historian named Andrew Burstein wrote a book, a biography of him, I think in 2009. He's a historian of early 19th century presidents. He wrote a book on Jefferson. He wrote a book on Jackson, I think. There's been another biography in the 21st century as well. So he gets some attention, but certainly deserves more.
I would say so. You've turned me into a believer. So I will tell everyone to read Washington Irving now. Yeah, it was a delightful occasion for me personally.
And if you read the Knickerbocker history, I should call it A History of New York, because it's Dietrich Knickerbocker's A History of New York.
Right.
But you should read Sal Magundy, which is the satirical collection he published just before it, which is a joint effort, but it's very amusing, funny about New York. The first decade of the 19th century in New York City, New York had a population of almost 100,000 by 1810, so it was a pretty dynamic city already at the beginning of the 19th century. Of course, there were huge political wrangling going on at the time. Dewitt Clinton was an influential figure there. He's a governor, and he was kind of Jeffersonian figure of great learning. And I've read an article about how some of the satire against Jefferson also sort of overlaps with satire against Dewitt Clinton, who was a sort of an icon at the time as well. But the wonderful thing is the Library of America has some of Irving's best work now available, and I think three editions, 3 different compilations of his writing. And this is from the first one. It came out in the 1980s.
I'm sure they will appreciate the promotion.
Yeah.
So I don't mind plugging their books more often if they want to get in contact with me. Well, it was a wonderful conversation, Dr. Cook. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this text before we bring it to a close? I've got a crock pot cooking behind me, so I probably need to attend to it.
I just hope people enjoy this book. It's got some real comic energy. It shows that politics was kind of crazy at the beginning of American history, and now we see it reaching an apotheosis of craziness in the last couple of weeks, I guess. But go out and read it and enjoy.
5 stars, highly recommended from me. And thank you, Dr. Cook, again for sharing your knowledge with us. I'm sure it goes without saying that we're all very appreciative.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.